Hi, welcome to another episode of Rewrite the Rule. Today we have a very special guest, Dr. Rao. Dr. Rao is the Executive Director of INSEAD Africa Initiative and Hoffman Institute for Business and Society Asia. And I'm going to let her tell you a little bit more about what she does and what's her journey been.
Thank you so much, Ritu. Just before this, I was also the founding executive director for the INSEAD Emerging Markets Institute and Gender Initiative, both of which are very close to my heart. Besides my work with INSEAD, I also sit on various boards and advisory boards. My key interest in a lot of these tends to become about leveling the ecosystem, whether it is based on gender differences or in terms of regional differences often. Entrepreneurial ecosystem is an important part of what I do. My current research and teaching is in leadership, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and also in ESG factors. So more specifically, the sort of cusp between the two, the intersection between inclusion and sustainability.
Wow. That's a lot. And that's so impressive. So, Vinika, let me ask you, as you look back at your career, did you always want to be where you are now?
No, never. And when I think back to the person I was when I first started my career, many eons ago, after doing my MBA from IIM Bangalore, I would have never dreamt that I would end up in education. At that point, I was following the well-trodden, straight and narrow path of a lot of business school graduates, study hard, get good grades, do an MBA from a reputed business school, and then get a job with a good bank. And then that's where you sort of work. And I really thought that I would retire from that first job. But then, as it often does, life intervened, various circumstances changed. And many changes sort of transpired. When I look back now, it does feel like quite a roller coaster of a ride.
Vinika, as you look back at your career, could you think of one or two defining moments or pivotal moments that kind of reshaped or made you change your journey?
Absolutely. And the first one came actually not very long after I started my first job. I always tell my students that one of the most important personal and professional decisions that they'll ever make in their lives will be the choice of the person they decide to spend their personal lives with. I met the person I was going to marry. It was a mix of a heady romance and some amount of, almost rational thinking through. And we got married within a year. And what actually happened then was, my brand new husband, he was also a banker. He was on a business trip abroad and he was approached for a very interesting job opportunity in a country that he knew very little about and that I knew very little about. None of us had ever visited, but the work sounded very innovative. The salary was tempting. We were young. So we sort of packed our bags and promptly landed up in Jakarta, Indonesia. And that I think really was, that was quite a sort of pivotal moment because, I had gone from being on a fast track banking career. I just received a Star of the Year award and, things were looking good on my professional front. And suddenly, and then voluntarily, it wasn't something that was wished upon me. We thought it through together. It was a conscious decision that we made together. But suddenly I became a trailing spouse. Which was, it caused a lot of confusion in my mind in terms of my personal identity. But, I adjusted to the expat wife. I took up jobs with various Asian conglomerates and MNCs. I joined an American firm in the field of industrial chemicals, which is something I knew nothing about. And after some years of working with them, I became their first female, first Asian and youngest general manager. And so I guess they killed a lot of birds with that stone. And I think for me, that is something that sort of helped define the person I became afterwards. So now, Ritu, in the aftermath of the Asian economic crisis of the late 1990s, I joined up with a group of former bankers. We started a boutique advisory firm and we helped to restructure companies that were struggling to survive. And this was actually in some ways the most frightening and challenging part of my career. I remember I had just completed a large restructuring deal. I paid the down payment for a condominium with my bonus and was basically once again living the MBA dream, this time as a consultant rather than as a banker. When a former client asked me to join his company as their managing director. Now, after you've gotten used to being a consultant who's paid to tell other people what to do, suddenly here I was with the chance to walk the proverbial talk.
Yeah.
The interesting thing was that, along the years, as I moved up the corporate ladder, I was frequently invited to be a guest lecturer or a speaker by various colleges, in India, Australia, Indonesia, Singapore, wherever I was working at the time. And when we moved to Singapore some 16 years back, I felt the need for some balance between the sort of grueling corporate work schedule that I had and spending some time with my young daughter. So quite serendipitously at that time, I met a professor from a leading business school here in Singapore who suggested that I use my corporate experience to teach business strategy to MBAs. And that's how my academic career commenced. And I think this is where I found my true calling in the second innings of my career in the field of management education.
Wow. Okay, great. So there's a point you made about when you moved with your spouse, with your husband. You talked about personal identity. You said you went as a trailing spouse and you talked that you had to recreate your identity. I know a lot of emerging women leaders look at marriage as that first step where things are going to change for them. So talk a little bit about what are some of the things you did as you were kind of redefining your personal identity during that time.
I think the first thing I should clarify is that while in this case I was the trailing spouse, that's not always been the situation. It was a voluntary decision. It was a decision that my husband and I, who are very much equal partners in our relationship, we took that decision together. There have been other times in our respective careers where the reverse decision has happened, where he has, been the trailing spouse, at least for some time for my career, or at least he's done the travel or I've done the travel to be where he is, etc. So, so that I think that's very important. It gives you a great sense of comfort and independence when it's an equal decision. It's a voluntary decision that you take together. So yes, there was a time, a few months, when I wasn't doing anything, and I really never had this situation where I was not working every day and, with 100 things to sort of juggle between. I had to keep reminding myself it was a decision I had made myself. When you can't blame someone else for it, then you tend to get on with it. And that's, I think, what stood me in good stead. And what I did do was keep a very open mind to all possible opportunities. I knew there were months where I was happy to sort of teach English if I had to keep busy. And that happened too, because it was a new country. We were sort of trying to identify what we could do. My educational qualifications were not necessarily clear to the organizations in the country that we were in. They couldn't pronounce the name of my college and were, a little bit suspicious about where the school was. And so that's also part of sort of understanding how you can explain then, what you can stand for and the kind of effort that you can put in. But I think one lesson I learned quite early was that, you keep an open mind and you just show people that you're willing to do what it takes. And in the most part, people will then take a chance.
Very nice. Yes. And actually, I can, your story resonates with me because when I left my corporate career after 20 years to start doing what I do now is, working with leaders and coaching and speaking, there was a time I went through recreating my identity because I know the corporate world gives you certain titles, certain thing, and then you go from that to like now nobody, so to say, in terms of your title. So yeah, I'm glad you talked about that. The other thing I wanted to ask you is that the jump from, or the switch from corporate C-suite to academia to teaching, how was that? How did you straddle that, or how did you adjust into that?
So in the first part, I have to acknowledge there was a huge element of serendipity, as I said earlier. I just happened to meet someone who's a professor at NTU. And, he said that I was doing a lot of guest speaking anyway. And he said, your sessions go very well. Just come and teach a course. Now, I don't know, maybe if I hadn't met him, it might have taken a bit longer for me to find that educational career. But that just sort of transpired on its own. And I have to admit, not with that much effort on my part. But I think where the effort came in was that once I decided that I was going to do this, and I had to make sure that I did it well. And, so I really worked hard. I sort of looked into all, videos of how people teach. I would sort of go and sit in the classes to get a sense of, what works well or not. So constant learning, lifelong learning is something we talk about at INSEAD. And I think this is something that, we talk about all the time in Singapore in terms of skills future and training. So, for instance, wherever I went, if I was speaking in a conference, for instance, people would assume I had a PhD, so they would all call me Dr. Rao. And so I decided I better make an honest woman of myself and spend the time and effort that it took to actually then do that degree, which was not easy. I was working a full-time job already, but I felt like, this is something that I could do to really sort of train myself and prepare myself for this new sort of career that I had taken upon myself. And so it was 4.5 years of very hard work, juggling a full-time career, sitting in the classroom as a student, as opposed to being the person who's conducting classes or, arranging programs. And that was quite a challenge, but it worked. And I think what was very interesting was it also allowed me to make a switch in the subjects I was working on. So previously I would teach strategy and international finance. And then with this thesis, I had the opportunity to explore something that I had been passionate about in a personal capacity, but had not really embraced professionally, the concept of leadership diversity. And after quite a lot of soul searching, it wasn't easy, but it was well received. And I remember our husbands had created a sort of support WhatsApp group to, pick us up, drop us off because we were studying Friday, Saturday, Sunday, doing full-time classes after a full week of work. And the group was called something which I think defined everything about that time in our lives. And the group was called, the WhatsApp group was called What Were They Thinking? Because we were in a position where, so why did you do this to yourself? You had a good career, everything was going smoothly. Now you've taken this upon yourself. But I think the reason we did it, what I was thinking was that if this is what I'm going to do, then I'm going to do it well. Yeah. And I'm going to put in the effort that it requires. And I think that has helped and stood me in good stead.
Absolutely. Oh my God. I mean, I can only imagine all that effort and especially studying to get your PhD. So well done on that. Vinika, could you talk about one or two key challenges that you faced during this journey?
I think one that was very important is in terms of just feeling confident about yourself, and I think like a lot of other women colleagues, I have suffered from the imposter syndrome. My bosses have told me in the past that I need to sort of assert myself, make sure people recognize me for what I'm doing, especially, when you move careers, as you were saying, or you redefine your identity, and then you end up in fairly senior roles. There is a sense of, I haven't been in this field very long. Maybe I'm the general manager now, but look, I'm the only one at this table who's not a chemical engineer. Are they going to take me seriously or not? And sometimes it's a realistic fear. It's a well-founded fear. People don't always take you seriously if they feel that, this is a career banker. What is she doing here? Sort of a thing. So I think that part is very important in terms of, the challenges that one needs to overcome. Another one was the idea of creating visibility, consciously working on this. And again, I had an issue that one of my friends and colleagues actually pointed out. And he said that, look, you put in this extra effort and you were sort of creative. And so you make things flow smoothly. But the problem with that is you make it look very easy. And what happens then? And I say this with all humility, it's, it becomes easy because you work very hard at it. But what that does then is that people then don't recognize the work that you're actually doing. And this is a problem that I've seen with a number of, especially women colleagues. We tend to sort of just take on everything that needs to be done and somehow make it happen. And then because it's going so well, everyone assumes that, okay, well, this was easy. Give her something more. This isn't enough really of what she's doing. And the only time you really get recognized for how much you have managed to juggle is when you move on to something else. And then the person who takes on the role says, there's no way I can manage all this. I don't know how she was doing this, but you need to give me another assistant or something to make it happen. So I think that's another part. And in terms of creating visibility for that, because, I do suffer from, again, this syndrome, which I've seen frequently with my female colleagues, which is about, if I do my job well, it'll get recognized. It will be recognized. Why do I need to make noise about it? But as I, again, speak with my students all the time, this is unfortunately very rarely true. When everyone else is kicking up a ruckus, making so much noise about achievements on social media, etc., if you don't say anything, unfortunately, it will go unnoticed. Right. And so there is merit in finding a way to, without, blowing an empty trumpet, but sort of consciously, carefully, and in a very dignified manner, creating some visibility for yourself. Right. Now, the one area that I think perhaps I'm better at, and that might have helped overcome these two challenges that I spoke about, is my genuine interest in people. It's not, about networking or, how can they help or how can I help them? It's just about, having conversations, listening to them, understanding what makes them tick. And I think that helps then to create mutually beneficial relationships. And so the networks build without even consciously trying.
That's correct. That's correct. And Vinika, you said you said few things which really stood out for me. Tell me about these two things, the feeling confident and especially creating visibility. How have you managed it? Because you do so much, so how have you managed to create the right amount of visibility for yourself?
So, as I was saying, I think having those relationships that one creates and without consciously sort of networking, just talking to a lot of people, trying to understand how we can collaborate and work well together. I think that sort of creates a kind of supportive environment around you.
Correct.
I also always talk about research that we've had at INSEAD where we talk about women being over-mentored and under-sponsored. So I think what helps is to find a few people who are going to be real allies, who will be sponsors, not just one more person who's trying to give you advice. As I remember in an interview that I had conducted some time back for research that we were doing at the Emerging Markets Institute, one of the young aspiring women leaders said something that has again stayed with me, the concept of an unwanted well-wisher syndrome. You're not looking for people who will sort of make decisions on your behalf or assume that you don't want to travel because you have a young child, etc.
Yeah.
But you're looking for people who will, at least when there is an opportunity, they will present it to you. They will make sure that it is positioned correctly and you are positioned correctly, and then you make the choice. So always ask, don't assume, So I think one thing that's worked well for me is I have found that support. I have found people who can be allies, and I'm very willing to ask for help. So that's the other thing, one mustn't hesitate to ask for help. And I've never had someone who I've reached out to who has said no, provided, of course, I make it very easy for them to help me. So if I'm asking for something, even if it's an introduction, I will make sure that I'll write an email in such a way that all the person has to do is to literally just forward the email or cut and post, as opposed to, oh, can you help me with this? And then it's a very general request. Again, this is something that I say when people reach out on LinkedIn. People like you and I were in this kind of field. We have many thousands of people that we connect with on LinkedIn. And every once in a while, I'll get requests. So could you help connect me with this? Or can you give me some advice on that? And I find that even though I try to respond as much as possible, the connections or the messages that I respond to with the most alacrity will be the ones that are easy for me to respond to.
Yeah.
If all you're asking for is a very structured piece of information, then it's very easy for me to give it to you. But if you make a general request, you're in the field, can you help me or some such, then obviously it becomes so difficult for us to work on that.
Correct. Yeah, I think, again, that's a really good point about asking for help. That comes up so often. Vinika, the point that you made about over mentoring and under sponsorship, under sponsoring, right? Because sometimes people kind of confuse that, I have so many mentors and they think that's it, or those people keep giving advice. So it'll be nice to kind of hear the distinction just briefly from you.
Yeah. And I don't mean to knock mentorship. It's very important.
Sure.
And I've had some excellent mentors. I continue to have some great mentors, and I hope I'm supporting some people myself in that capacity. But I think what happens with sponsorship is you go one step ahead. It's not just about advising. It's not about sort of hand holding. It's about much more, because most women, let's face it, they're all well qualified. They're good at what they're doing.
Yeah.
They're not aspiring to something that they are not prepared for. So then what they're looking for really is just that, that little extra bit that needs to happen. So in terms of sponsorship, when it's helpful, for instance, when there's a role that's coming up and you go out there and you make that introduction. Or there's a promotion that's coming up and perhaps there is someone in your network who's very good and likely, could be a good candidate. But if there's something missing in their profile, in her profile or his profile, their profile, then you make that step. You sort of tell them, this is what's missing. And by the way, there's this course you could attend, or there's this, this experience that you could gain, which will help you with this. So that kind of active support, as opposed to, I think this will be good for you to do. And another thing I could mention in this regard is I think that it's very important when, this kind of sponsorship must be measured and must have KPIs associated with it. So
Yeah.
again, just yesterday, I was having a conversation with one of the CEOs that we work with in terms of saying that, what KPIs have you set up for your C-suite executives in terms of, sponsorship, or in terms
Yeah.
of creating gender balance or creating racial balance, whatever kind of imbalance they're facing. Because let's face it, and we know this from business school jargon also, what gets measured gets done. So it's very important
That's
to
right.
make especially the top leaders responsible for some of these things. We talk about what makes people feel truly included in an organization. And again, research will show you that 70% of why people say they feel included in an organization is down to the leaders. It's down to the kind of environment the leaders create, the kind of commitment that they demonstrate, the awareness of their own biases that they are willing to share, the humility that they have, all of these, and then the openness to collaborate.
Right. No, that's great. I want to ask you, you've had like a long journey with so many changes and switches. If you were to look back and advise your younger self, what advice would you give her?
A couple of things come to mind very quickly. I did my doctorate in the subject of male allyship. I would definitely have told my young self at that point, which is about finding these allies, identifying and then working closely with such allies. I have been very lucky to have a couple of male bosses in the past who have been extremely supportive. So if you find an ally of that kind in the workplace, then that's very important. The other thing that I briefly touched upon earlier is in terms of finding the right person to marry or to spend your personal life with. Very important, because that can really identify the kind of person you become, and the support that you can create for each other can become very, very important. One other thing I would say is don't plan too much, don't overthink it, and don't be too much of a perfectionist, because really life has its own way of taking things and making things happen. It's not always going to go exactly as you plan. In my case, and on the personal front, I was trying to have a baby, and that was taking longer than I'd hoped for. And, that really knocked me off kilter for a bit. So again, don't overthink it, and, be adaptable, go with the flow to some extent. One thing that I have learned also in my interactions with our young MBAs, plan your career to some extent around not just what you think will happen professionally, but also along some of the personal milestones that you will want to achieve. Most women will probably want to have, if they don't want to marry, at least have a significant other in their lives. Now, that's going to happen, and that will have some impact on what you're able to do. So it's useful to factor that into your career plans, because it will, make a difference. And then always remember that, the world we live in is ever changing. Earlier in the classroom, we would talk about the VUCA world, which you might have heard of, right? Volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity, etc. And now when I'm talking to our younger, participants, they talk about other things. There are other terms. There's Barney, brittle, anxious, non-linear, and incomprehensible. There's rupt, which is rapid, unpredictable, paradoxical, and tangled. And I have another one for you. It's tuna, turbulent, uncertain, novel, and ambiguous. So, that's the world you're living in. So, as I said, be open to change. And at some point, the lesson from, very famous scripture, put in your best effort and then don't worry about the consequences after that.
That's right. Oh God, that is such pearls of wisdom there, Vinika. Thank you so much for sharing. Is there anything else that you would want to say to our listeners that we haven't covered and which you think is going to be very helpful for them?
So I remember in sort of, when you told me about this podcast, you'd also mentioned, what do you define as success, or what does success mean to you? I think it's about doing something that I truly enjoy doing. I really feel fortunate because I go into work and I feel like I'm doing something that may contribute in the smallest possible way towards influencing at least those within my sphere to intentionally and inclusively create profit with purpose.
Correct.
The other thing that really, stands in my mind is, for instance, if I get an unexpected email from a student several years after they've graduated saying that, you said this to me once that many years ago, and it changed my life, and I'll always be grateful.
Wow.
Now, what can be more important and more inspiring than that? And I think the other thing that that's important to mention also is that, for me, having a daughter who's my best friend, who is personally very independent, is now, embarking on her own career and off to a good start. And she's also a human being that I respect. Now, that's something that makes me feel like I've been successful. And also having wonderful people like you, Ritu, in my circle, people that, I can count upon, that I can collaborate with, who are consciously working to create this sort of a learning and developing environment that we can all benefit from. I think that's truly something that I feel is part of the success we can enjoy.
Wow, that's a lot of stuff and a lot to ponder about. If I were to kind of just, from this conversation, there were three things. First thing that I picked up, and we started talking about it right in the beginning, is selecting a right partner. I think that has been so important, selecting a right spouse or right partner, because that kind of really makes your professional and personal journey so smooth. The other thing that stood out for me was about finding allies early on. In your case, you said male allies, female allies could be a combination, but really finding those bunch of people who will support you through the journey. And I think earlier we invest in those, there is chances of success as we move forward. And the third thing, obviously, as you said, is that creating visibility. That one really stood out for me, because as you were saying this, I could think of myself and so many other women leaders that I work with and I have worked with, where we just put in the effort, everything runs smooth, and it just looks like, oh, this looked quite easy. But actually it is behind the scene that people didn't see. So to create the right amount of visibility, whether it's on LinkedIn, whether it's on other social media platform, but just to be able to do that more. I could go on, but those are the top three, Dr. Rao. And it's been such a pleasure talking to you. And I'm sure our listeners are going to really enjoy this episode. So thank you once again for your time.